I am Gale Haydock, and this is August 25th, 1989, and my son Bob Haydock III has asked me to talk a little bit about my grandparents. And I will start talking about my mother's parents, and he has written down some things that he wanted me to mention. My mother's father was Henry Olin Wilson. I would imagine that he would have been born in about 1870. Unfortunately, he died when I was about 1 year old, too young for me to remember him. He was a very wonderful looking man, tall and thin with a heavy mustache. We have a wonderful picture of him standing with his wife, my grandmother. She was very petite, and they made a very handsome couple. He was in the wool business and did very well. My grandmother always lived very comfortably after his death, and she was a widow for many years. She died while I was in college, which was would have been in the late 40s, when she would have been in her early 60s. I can't tell you too much about my grandfather, not having known him, except that my mother remembered him with great fondness and spoke of him with great affection and considered it a terrible loss. When he died in somewhat unclear circumstances, it has never been clear whether he fell or whether he jumped from a balcony in a hospital where he was being treated. He invested heavily in Swedish matches, and a large amount of money was lost during the Depression. That may have contributed to his medical problems. I really am not clear about that. But that was the date of the crash was approximately the date of his death. My grandmother I remember with great affection. She was always terribly kind to me and managed to make me feel as though I were really one of her most favorite granddaughters. She and my grandfather lived most of their lives in Summit, New Jersey, where my mother grew up. After my mother's marriage and moved to Louisville, Kentucky, my grandmother eventually moved to Louisville as well to be near my mother, who was her only child at that point. She had had a second child, a son, who died as a baby of diphtheria. And somehow, I don't know why, my mother always felt that it was her fault that her baby brother became ill and died. I don't have any reason to know, I don't have any way of knowing why she felt that way. But one of my sisters told me that she discovered somehow that my mother always felt terrible guilt about her little brother's death. And this may have accounted for her tremendous fixation on physical health. She always insisted that we wear warmer clothes and took more naps and were more protected from a health point of view than we felt was what we wanted to do, or from what was the practice of other families that we knew. My grandmother not only moved to Louisville to be near my mother, but She also spent her summers in the house next door to us in Centerville on Cape Cod. My parents had bought a funny old summer house far from handsome, but right on the beach, on a comfortably large lot. And the story goes, although I don't remember it, that a friend of theirs who was an architect designed a house to be built right next door to our house at Cape Cod. And my grandmother said, fine, you go ahead and build it. And she never saw any of the work in progress, but when she arrived back at the Cape the following early summer, the house was complete. And it was an adorable house, built on a rather small scale. As I say, she was a rather small person. There was a little courtyard in between the houses, and our summers were spent traveling back and forth between my grandmother's house and our house, and I remember those as very happy times. She loved music, and she had a piano in her house, and I was the only granddaughter who really liked to play the piano, which was one of the reasons that we were quite close. She loved the songs of Edward McDowell, and she loved them so much that she insisted on paying me $5 for every piece of his music that I learned to play. And I remember the first one that I learned was To a Wild Rose, and it was sort of a dippy piece of music, but she loved it, and I enjoyed playing it for her. I was much more interested in learning to play the kinds of music that my contemporaries liked to gather around the piano to hear, and I made quite a thing of that. And she enjoyed hearing the contemporary popular music as well. And I spent many, many hours at that piano with her sitting in her chintz-covered chair, just smiling and listening to me play. And if I turned slightly to the right from the piano, I could look out over the ocean. It was very pleasant and very nice. She also loved to go to the movies, and so did I. My parents did not think it was very proper for children to go to the movies. Somehow that was on their list of not great things for children to do. But the times that I went to visit my grandmother just by myself, we went to the movies a lot. And she loved them all. It didn't matter what they were about, and I loved them all too. She was a devout Christian Scientist. This was something that she took up in her later life as a result of my other grandmother, my fraternal grandmother's interest in Christian Science. And she believed very, very deeply in Christian Science, and the church was extremely important to her. I don't remember that she had any particular causes. She was not a political person. She was not involved particularly in do-good kinds of efforts. Her church and her daughter and her granddaughters were very important to her. She had two sisters, both of whom also moved to Louisville. They were right across the street from each other, one on each corner of the street that ended where my grandmother's apartment were. They were rather abrupt women, and my mother used to be amused and somewhat impatient with the fact that the three of them, her mother and her two aunts, had a hard time getting along with each other all the time. I don't believe she went to college. I don't recall ever any mention of her having gone to college, but she was a very intelligent woman, not necessarily outward looking, not very gregarious, a very quiet, private person, but a very sweet, gentle person. She never had any pets that I can think of. She had very loyal servants who stayed with her for years at a time, that were also very patient and very nice to us. But I think of her as a very positive and very dear part of my early life.